So I'm Laura. I work with Helena at Local Futures. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before Helena begins the webinar, I'm just going to carry out a few admin tasks. You're all automatically on mute, just to avoid any background noise, and there will be an opportunity during the chat to disable that so we can all have a conversation together. If you have any questions during the webinar, please could you put them in the chat box, and you just need to make sure that above the chat box it says 2, and you need to select all panelists and attendees so I can see it. And then there'll be times during the webinar where Helena will pause and we'll ask questions. And some of you, I imagine, won't be able to stay for the full hour and a half. So I just wanted to share with you the next steps for after this webinar, which is joining the International Alliance of Localization. This is an alliance that Helena's organization, Local Future, set up in 2014. We now have over 900 members in 58 different countries, and it's a cross-cultural network of thinkers, activists, and anyone interested in localizing and wanting to connect with others doing so around the world. And it's the perfect place to carry on the discussion after this webinar, and you can sign up on our website. If you go to localfutures.org, you can go to, in the top menu under our projects, you'll see the International Alliance Localization there, and there's a very simple sign up form. And once you're a member, you gain access to our listserv where you can carry on chatting with each other, and our Facebook group as well. And we have just launched the Voices of the IAL video project. The end result of this is to create a compilation of 2-minute videos from International Alliance of Localization members discussing the importance of localization. So if any of you feel very inspired after this, it would be amazing if you could record a simple 2-minute video of yourself explaining what local means to you. And you can share that with us either via email, on the listserv, or the Facebook group. So that's everything from me. I'll now hand over to Helena, and we'll explore how you can be part of the transition towards a future that places human and ecological well-being front and center during coronavirus and after the pandemic as well.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks for getting all of this set up, and thanks to all of you who've joined. I wish more people who signed up would join, because at the last one there were people who couldn't sign up because so many had signed up, but then only half came. So yeah, it'd be great to have feedback from people about whether you think it would be a good idea to charge a small amount so that if people signed up, they would actually then come, or at least more than half, which is right now what it seems to be. So we are in this very, very fortunate position of having been working at the grassroots, literally on every continent for, in my case, for 45 years. And it's given us this absolute faith in human beings. It's given us the conviction also that nature can heal so much faster than we think, if just given a little bit of a chance, just given a little bit of help. So we feel, so motivated now, particularly during this dreadful pandemic, this very frightening pandemic. We feel very, very motivated to get out to more people, this broader paradigm, basically. It's a different set of lenses through which you can see the world. It's information about the world that most people haven't been getting, because it's information that's not been getting out in the media, it's not been in mainstream academia. Basically, it's been at the grassroots, quietly at the grassroots, without help from any of the dominant sources of knowledge and information. So, yeah, there is this far simpler way forward. It is like it's right under our noses, but we've been led into such an over-intellectualized, compartmentalized, complicated way of seeing things. And we've been led into a very complex, inefficient way of doing things. So we sort of lost in a man-made world, and man-made is really the appropriate word. It's been, as many people would say, a patriarchal system. it's more than just critiquing capitalism. It's really, I think this is another very positive thing about what we have to offer, is something that transcends the political divide that really has become a terrible, vicious theater of people posturing and trying to score points, and in a relatively meaningless debate. And the reason it's relatively meaningless is because, particularly when it comes to the deep truth about the need for biodiversity, for the fabric of life to survive, when it comes to the deep truth about what we human beings need to flourish, and flourishing means being able to live in a way that allows us to operate in a more collaborative way rather than in a fearful, intensely competitive way. There is another way forward, and basically the best word that we have found, and I think more and more people are finding, that localization is a very appropriate term, and it is in contrast to what has been fundamentally a globalizing path, a path that has been constructed through the power of global traders, the global players that started already with Christianity, moving across the world, robbing people of their self-respect, of their language, of their myths, of their origin stories, essentially telling them that they were wrong, and not only telling them that they were wrong, but the story was, we are wrong from birth. We are wrong. Our bodies are wrong. We are dirty. We want to move away from the senses into this pure, clear light. Now, I'm not at all trying to dismiss Christianity of today as that kind of barbaric form that it took with the Inquisition, where also millions of women were burned at the stake. That is not the Christianity of today, and that's another part of the story that I would like to tell. But as we look back historically, we did have a very brutal beginnings for a global system that has come to conquer the entire world. And it, as I said, started with this brutal Christianity and then moved into essentially genocide and slavery, force, where global traders were able to imprison people on the other side of the world in a system that didn't allow them to produce for themselves, but they were moved on to monocultures for export or into mines and onto tea plantations. And in the meanwhile, these global European players were getting richer and richer. Now, in the modern era, particularly after the Second World War, what happened is that government leaders, well-intentioned people, believed that the way to avoid another world war, the way to avoid another depression, was to roll out the red carpet for global players and integrate everybody around the world into one so-called harmonious, they call it harmonization as well as integration. But the idea was that all economic activity would be integrated under one umbrella. And the umbrella was the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And like I said, there were a lot of well-intentioned people involved with this. And it was understandable. You know, the thought was, you know, if we're all linked together economically, we're not going to be fighting each other. And that storyline, that paradigm, is something that McDonald's and a lot of the giant multinationals have used a lot, arguing that, you know, two countries that have McDonald's don't go to war. I won't go into all the details why that is completely a false analysis and extremely misleading. I hope that most people intuitively can understand that there's a lot wrong with that. I also do want to say, please look at my very short book, Local is Our Future, where I go into a little bit more detail than I can now. But what happened after the Second World War that was so important and that most critics of so-called neoliberal economics have not focused enough on is that the IMF and the World Bank were set up at the same time as this GATT, this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, this was a process, and so it's much harder to sort of, it's not a static entity, and that's probably why it escaped a lot of scrutiny. But it was also because as this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was being imposed on countries as a process of deregulating global banks and global multinational industries, as that process was going on, in the media, most people would just hear, oh, countries are meeting to negotiate a trade treaty, and they would assume that it was very sad, you know, if the countries couldn't come to an agreement. That sounds rather negative. So the fact that they came away with an agreement, that sounded rather nice. And generally, people have been very sold on the idea that global trade does increase our well-being and that is good for us. Now, actually, what's been happening, particularly in the last 30 years, where this process of trade and finance deregulation has accelerated, and what has generally been described as neoliberal economics, what has been happening is that the average person has been getting poorer. Now, this is dramatically true in the industrialized world, where we have not been told, because we have not been measuring, we've not been looking at the honest truth of what it means to become wealthier. We've been looking at numbers. We've been hearing the story of GDP. We've been hearing the story of the market's doing well, and we've been told, for instance, that we're paying much less for our food now than we did 30, 40 years ago. That's not actually true. We're not paying less when we have to work many more hours to put food on the table. But that analysis of how many hours we're working in order to meet our basic needs is not the story that's been told, because all of us had fallen prey to believing the story of numbers and GDP. Now, GDP, which is the measure, the gross domestic product, is actually a measure which increases with commercialization. It literally means that if you plant a garden and eat vegetables out of your garden, it's an unpatriotic act, because literally GDP would suffer if millions of people did that. So right now, COVID, of course, you know, for us, it's an absolute wonderful effect of COVID that so many people are now planting vegetables and so on. And what's happening, and what happened before, is that when we do that, we are exercising this self-reliance, which is the biggest threat to economic growth. From the very beginning, the fundamental principle of the modern economy was something called comparative advantage, and it meant that, oh, no, don't think it's in your country's interest or in your region's interest to produce a range of things for yourself. No, don't create that, what I call community reliance. In other words, it's not about self, it's not about the individual self-reliance, but it's about communities and regions and even nations producing more of their own needs. No, the economic trajectory was specialized for export, specialized in what you were good at. Now that formula, up to a certain point, could make a bit of sense, but it's gone way into a madness, into what we call insane trade, where countries are regularly, and this has been progressing dramatically, particularly in the last 30 years, importing and exporting the same product. You know, literally water in, water out, butter in, butter out, milk in, and very often in almost identical quantities. So the statistic that I often refer to is 1 billion tons of beef exported from the US, 1 billion tons of beef, roughly, imported annually. Now, this has been going on more and more and in larger and larger quantities, and it has also included that the giants, the big supermarket chains and so on, have been flying apples from England to South Africa to be washed, flown back again, flying fish from Norway to China to be deboned, flown back again, shrimp from England to Thailand to be peeled, flown back again, nuts from Byron Bay, Australia, flown to China to be cracked open, flown back again. Now this has been going on in a geometric way. I mean, we do not have all the statistics, and the most tragic thing is that because most people have not known about this, the whole paradigm, the whole discussion about why we are, just look like the human race is hell-bent on destroying the living earth and creating more and more emissions that will, completely destroy us and threaten to destroy all life on earth. The discussion of the cause of that, the industrial cause of that, has been totally silent. And in the meanwhile, all the time the finger has been pointed at the individual, at you and me. The discourse has been, why are these people continuing to drive their cars and look at these emissions? They're going up and up and up. We've been hearing about climate change, and these people, they just don't want to change. They want to hold on to their nice lifestyles, and they just don't care. This is a completely false analysis, and what is led to is among people who have understood how vitally important climate is for stability, for health of ecosystems, and for our health, for those people, it has generated deep feelings of depression and despair and self-blame, self-guilt. For others who have not been so ecologically minded, it's led to anger and a rejection of the green agenda. It's very much contributed to votes for leaders like Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil, because people, as they've been squeezed economically, struggling to just survive, to pay for food and shelter, have been manipulated into believing that the problem is these greenies and these lefties who don't understand that in order to provide livelihoods, we've got to keep growing the economy. We're going to grow the economy, forget about the Amazon, forget about all this nonsense about indigenous people, as Bolsonaro in Brazil is saying. So without the big picture, without an honest assessment of what has been going on in the world, we have been lost and floundering. And really, it's not a question of, this is my idea and I'm, inventing some new theory. It's a question about information. And by the way, that's another thing that's been demonized as part of this fragmented discourse and discussion, only looking at what has the individual consumer been doing. And by the way, almost never talking about us as individual voters, but as individual consumers. Why haven't we changed our shopping habits enough to deal with climate change? And again, why haven't we stopped going on holiday and flying and still using our cars? Well, I can tell you why the majority haven't, because they have been imprisoned in a system that, among other things, made public transport so expensive that it's been much cheaper to travel by car in most countries, either so expensive or so rare. In most American cities, it barely exists. So we really need to look at the bigger picture. And part of that bigger picture would be to realize that when what we call the environmental movement started, which I was very involved in very early on in the mid-70s, and a little bit before that when it started, the emphasis in every country was on policy change. We all realized we wanted our governments to support decentralized development based on renewable energy. And that's what we were lobbying for, and we even started having some success. But then as the crises started growing and the heads of big business got involved, some of whom I knew personally, some of the key players. These people actually became very worried about the environmental issues, and they started getting involved in the discussion. One of them was someone in Maurice Strong, who organized the big meeting in Rio in '92, bringing together the entire global environmental movement out of good intention. But this was a self-made multimillionaire, and he wanted to talk to the CEOs, people of power. He also wrote a book with the Prime Minister of Norway. And unfortunately, from those heights of distant power and wealth, the last thing they could see was that fundamentally the scale of business and their global activities had far more to do with climate change and the destruction of forests and the fisheries with the giant trawler nets, fishing, half the life out, throwing, with these giant nets that can take about 18 jumbo jets in each net. Take all of that life out of the sea and then keep maybe a third and dump the rest dead back. Monocultural plantations in forestry, and above all in food and farming, bigger and bigger monocultures. All of this was deadly for life on Earth. All of it created massive CO2 emissions as well as extinction of species. And all of it was linked to this dependence around the world on global traders, on multinationals. So that wasn't part of the discussion. And then as big business got more and more involved, they were also funding, either through government or directly, the environmental movement. Now, I just want to say very clearly that my experience is that the big problem we're facing is that the system has become so big that almost no one has been stepping back to look at how this system operates. And that includes the people at the top. Many people will get angry with me when I try to say that my experience is that the people at the top are not conscious of the destruction they're wreaking. That is my experience. I know it's often very convenient not to be aware, and that of course reinforces this lack of awareness. But above all, those of us who are working in the environmental movement, the peace movement, the women's movement, the movement for democracy, the movement for climate, to really deal with climate in a meaningful way, all of us concerned with the environment really need to come together, not into one united organization, but into a clarity about the need for system change. And what does that systemic change look like? That's where we feel that we have a clarity from international experience. And that experience includes having systematically studied with teams of people, the impact of globalization on different countries and different cultures and ecosystems, as well as pioneering and helping to start this bottom-up movement that we call localization. And from that experience, I would say that I'm absolutely convinced that to restore biodiversity, to restore genuine, thriving ecosystems, as well as human beings, a shift in direction, systemic shift in direction towards localization is essential. How far we go, how local, that's another question. And this is something that in Local Futures we want to be writing more about in terms of our thinking about that. But our premise is that people need to be engaged in this discussion. They need to be more aware of what's been happening globally and understand better why at the local level it has been so difficult to do the right thing, and why the whole, premise that it's we as individual consumers that are responsible for this system and that we as individual consumers are going to change it. That concept is what has hampered us enormously in these last 30 years. Now, once we expand the I to a we, and this is something that we've been encouraging for a long time, and we hope that now in this COVID lockdown, that people will want to try to explore this issue, really asking the question, why do we seem to be facing such dramatic crises, one after the other? Why is the gap between rich and poor growing wider and wider? And actually, I need to say, most people don't know, perhaps, that it's getting wider and wider in every country. I know of no exception. No country in Scandinavia, Bhutan, Ladakh, China. In every country, the gap between rich and poor has been growing obscenely. And most people have been aware of it. But most people have not been allowed to see that this is a global problem. And particularly, they've not been allowed to see that it's because of a global system, and that the discussion within each country remains locked in an outdated left-right discussion that has become almost obscene too, because you can just see politicians more and more doing nothing but proving that they're better than the other side. And if we understood the global system, we would also see that left and right, and that again in Scandinavia, have been pursuing the same policy, systematically giving more power to global corporations. And with it, what's been happening is that every business, every individual operating at the local, regional, or national level has been hampered by often very counterproductive regulations. We need regulations for sure, but we haven't understood that as we've been regulating a lot of small farmers, small family-owned restaurants, whatever, health centers, schools, we have not understood how it's been playing right into the hand of the giant conglomerates that have been deregulated, freed of regulation. And they had actually had governments signing in black and white a contract that says, we won't do anything that will inhibit your profit-making potential. If we do, we sign here in black and white, government, Australia, Sweden, if we reduce your profit-making potential, you can take us to court. You can sue us. We agree you can do that. Now that is an utter, total, absolute dismantling of any type of democracy. Most people haven't known about it. Most ministers in most governments haven't known about it. And yet it's not a secret in the sense that it's happening, with a few nasty, wealthy billionaires in a dark room smoking big fat cigars. No, it's not been happening. It's a secret that's out in the open, and yet no one talks about it. I mean, my conclusion after many, many years of talking to journalists, talking to environmentalists and so on, is that somehow there has been either a self-censoring, thinking if I touch that, it's a bit too, I'm going to be marginalized. It sounds a bit too much like conspiracy theory or something like that. Or there's also been, I've been told by many journalists, this is so dry and so technical, people aren't interested. And I think another thing that plays into it is that I believe that most people in the activist movements have sort of decided that that big system can't be changed. So there's no point thinking about it. It's very complicated, no point, can't really change it. And really, I do feel that in the West, most people have come to think of this big economic system as some kind of evolutionary process that can't be changed. And that is probably one of the main reasons why people haven't been looking at that big system. And I probably I shouldn't be belaboring it too much because I really want to get you above all excited about localization. But I can't get over the conviction that if more people knew genuinely what's been happening at the global level, that we would be so much stronger in, giving a lot of energy and weight and power to a localizing path. Now, a localizing path, what does it mean? It means that at a policy level, well, first of all, let me say, maybe start by saying that we have been urging people to look at this in terms of what they can do is a two-pronged thing they can do. One of them is at their local level. Even if they live in New York City or in Sydney, in a large city, they can join or help start a localization initiative. And I'll come back to talking a bit more about what they consist of. And that we urge people to do that as a group. So we see as one of the first steps, connect with a few like-minded people. You might find them by showing a film. You could tell them about our website or our film, The Economics of Happiness, or try to get 2 or 3 people who want to go on this journey with you, on this rethinking the big picture, with the idea that we can heal ecosystems and societies and individuals simultaneously. There is actually a systemic path that is win-win-win, multiple wins simultaneously, just like the other path has been a lose-lose-lose economy. Devastating nature, devastating people, widening the gap, destroying democracy. So ideally link up, connect with a few like-minded people, and then perhaps together or even as a group, some might do one aspect of something, other members might do another. Maybe the group will be as big as 10 or 15 that might meet regularly. Right now, I'm hoping that these groups would start by using Zoom or connecting in this way while rethinking the assumptions. You could, for instance, decide to read things independently and then come together to discuss them. And we would very much want to interest you in coming to our website for lots of readings, really a curriculum that we have available of films and readings and blogs. And then once you can get out, actually starting or joining localization initiatives. And we are particularly keen that the foundational brick in creating a local economy should include food. And I want to come back to that as well, but just to say that food, local business alliances, with the idea of localizing, local financing, local energy schemes. Now, remember, local as a systemic path is not just about saying, oh, well, I've got Coca-Cola factory in our city or in our neighborhood, so they're local, so we're going to work with them. Localizing is about beginning to link up production and consumption over shorter distances, more direct relationships, more human scale relationships. And it's about linking up that production to local resources as much as possible. Now, it's a process of shortening distances. So in many cases, for instance, when we've helped to start farmers markets around the world, people have sometimes come up with an idea that we're only going to have things that come from 50 kilometers away. And we've been trying to say, no, don't necessarily start with a rigid fundamentalist idea of distance. You might find that even buying things just from within your country is a step forward. If you've got, potatoes from Argentina or something, or, the garlic from China that's invaded virtually, France, Italy, all these countries that produce wonderful garlic. So start with the goal of understanding where things are coming from and shortening, and then more and more as growers are told that their goal is to localize further, they are encouraged to diversify. And this is a fundamentally important reason why localization is so important, because it creates a market pressure that encourages diversified production on the ground, which is why also permaculture is a very important part of the localization movement. But in terms of, another way of understanding it, it's also a shift away from a dependence on distant, enormous institutions, ultimately big businesses and big banks, towards institutions that have a human face, there's a name, and you might even be able to talk to these people as human beings, not a robot on the end of the line. So that human scale brings in more accountability, more visibility, and more community, more genuine interdependence. So this path of getting involved at the local level, we urge people to start with that, but very, very soon thereafter, particularly after, if you take the first step to connect with a few like-minded individuals, so you're not going at this, what can I do, but more, what can we do? The minute it becomes part of the group process, it becomes more enjoyable. It also becomes more powerful. You feel more energized. You feel more able. Now, I'm not saying that every single individual is likely to feel that way, but I would say as a general rule, that's our experience, and it's also our experience of how we evolved. We evolved much more interdependent and connected with one another. So it's deep in our DNA, the we as opposed to the I. But then we would like very soon that you also would be willing to look at the bigger picture in terms of how do we change policy and what would that look like. And there, we're saying that, simply speaking, we need to understand that governments have been working with these enormous businesses. And as I said, particularly since the Second World War, after it was institutionalized in the form of the GATT, the IMF, and the World Bank, but also, from the very beginning of this modern economy. And another watershed is in the last 30 years. I say last 30 years, am I right? I mean since the mid-80s. I've probably been saying 30 years for too long. It's a little bit more than that now. But it's been in the mid-80s that this process called globalization really took off in a new, invigorated form. And we were told in the industrialized world that we're going off to these poor countries. And so, sorry, we're taking your factories away and putting them over there. And when people objected, they often objected from their own national perspective, and it was painted as nationalistic and selfish. And they were told, you don't care about those poor people on the other side of the world. Now, in actual fact, what was happening was, as factories had the freedom to move around to poor countries, they were massively increasing your ecological footprint in the West. When your shoes and your t-shirts and everything you needed was produced in China or Indonesia or India, every single thing you used you ended up using much more energy, all the transport, and in many cases, multiple nations, and this mega scale, and meant that we were shifting our dirty laundry, our CO2 emissions to the other side of the world, but we didn't see it. And in this era of talking about climate, we didn't get to hear about that. And that's why, the self-blame and the anger from those who found their jobs had moved to the other side of the world and who were feeling marginalized and angry. So it is important to understand what's been going on, and it's important to understand that these key mechanisms, what governments use, mechanisms they use to shape the direction of the economy and to shape it either towards bigger and bigger, faster and faster, more global, more energy and technology dependent versus the localizing path, which would be exactly in the opposite direction. Let's use less energy, less resources wherever possible, where it makes sense. Let's shorten the distances, and with that, reduce the dependence on plastic and multitude of other things, and of course, reduce the emissions. So the mechanisms that have been used to accelerate this wasteful, energy-intensive, resource-intensive path have been taxes, subsidies, and regulations. So governments have used these instruments with the pressure from big business to support the wealth accumulation in the hands of the 1%, less than 1% actually. And now we need to say, sorry, we're going to have civic society at the table, those who are actively concerned about the environment, about justice, reducing the gap between rich and poor, genuine democracy. We are going to be at the table, and we're going to have new trade treaties. These treaties are going to give businesses a certain amount of time, but they're going to have to choose. They can't be multinationals that say to governments, you do as we say, or we'll go elsewhere. Or certainly we're not going to have contracts that says, you can sue us. On the contrary, the contracts will say, if you don't do as we say, we will ban you, and we'll do it collectively as part of international global collaborative treaties. Those treaties would, as part and parcel of this regulation of global, would be massively reducing emissions systemically. But part of the story that you need to know is that the current climate negotiations have been dominated by big business. The whole agenda to focus on carbon comes from big business, focusing on something that we can't see, we can't smell, we can't taste, and suddenly reducing everything to a tradable commodity that's being traded globally. This was a hijacking of our good intentions, an intellectual hijacking. So we need to be at the table. We need to have clarity about the need for more human scale, accountable, visible structures. And of course, this is not going to happen overnight, but it's a process, and the policy process involves re-regulation at the global level. And even as of today, we should be looking at careful and widespread deregulation at the local level. We should be looking at immediately shifting not money towards a type of universal basic income, but money to support a multitude of the businesses, the type of healthcare, the type of farming, the type of education that actually most people are really ready for. But they need to hear articulated how the schools could be actually producing children and producing young adults who have real knowledge about the real economy linked to healthy, really healthy businesses that support our well-being, support ecosystem health. What would that look like? We have lots of ideas, but I'm going on longer than I think I was meant to do now, because we'll start taking questions soon. So in terms of the policy change, there is this basic, shifting of regulations, taxes. Just think about it. Every business at the local and regional level squeezed with regulations and squeezed for taxes. What most people don't know is that the deregulation of global banks and finance has led to the creation of phantom money, literally make-believe money. I know it sounds unbelievable for many people, but well-trained, Harvard-educated economists can tell you about it. David Korten being one of the most prominent, and a close colleague in our alliance, our Forum on Globalization. So this phantom wealth is to a great extent, yeah, I would say it's the most important thing that's happened, but please don't look at it in isolation and don't think that by just fixing the money system without understanding the ecological realities that every single thing we use comes from the living earth, from Mother Earth. Every single thing, every iPad, every shoe, every building comes from the earth. So without ecological literacy, without a type of education, without knowledge systems where we are more connected to the resources we depend on, to the living earth we depend on, without that, we can fantasize about all kinds of new money systems, removed from that, and we're not going to be making the systemic progress we need to make. So I talk about eco-literacy being both ecological and economic literacy linked together, because the economy we must embrace, must recognize that it is the earth that feeds and clothes us. So I think there's a path forward that is already happening, and I didn't say enough about that. I just do want to say that food is the only thing that we produce that everybody needs every day. We now have a system that for quite a while has meant that government policy has separated us further and further from the source of our food, encouraged larger and larger monocultures, dead monocultures that are less productive per unit of land, per unit of water. We've been subsidizing inefficiency in the name of efficiencies of scale. When it comes to the real economy, the natural world, the efficiency of scale is the smaller the better. The smaller the better. If you can look after 1 square meter of land and tend to every seedling and really make sure that those earthworms have a happy home, when you just pick that one bit of fruit or that leaf that is really ready, when you tend to it in that close and intimate way, you'll be able to be far more productive and while nurturing life back to life. Now, this is true even on farms of hundreds of acres. I'm trying to see if I remember, if I have personal experience of farms with many thousands of acres where I've seen this. I'm not sure I do. I think more of the ones I know about are more, hundreds of acres, and what we can see there is the most wonderful restoration of diversity of life, of incredible productivity by diversifying. Most recently, the best film on this is The Biggest Little Farm. If you haven't seen it, please do. It shows vividly how you can take dead, unproductive land that's been destroyed by the agriculture our governments have been subsidized, the agriculture our scientific experts have been promoting, killing the land and impoverishing farmers, pushing them more and more into debt, bigger and bigger machineries, bigger and bigger debt, and inefficient, terrible waste. Now, on the other side, from the bottom up, there are millions of people demonstrating another way. Now, that million includes many peasant farmers in the so-called third world who are still close enough to the land to nourish it and not to destroy it, and who are, according to certain statistics, something like 70% of the food we eat still comes from them. I'm not so sure exactly about those numbers, but it's a very significant number, a very, very significant number of people. And then there are, new, local, the new local, which includes, this 5-acre farm in Japan where a farmer named Kaneko has shown that if Japan diversified, it could feed itself easily. He's growing everything you can imagine. He's, you know, that includes trees, it includes fruit, it includes vegetables, some animals, producing also some energy for his own machinery. And at that level, as part of highly diversified smaller systems, biodiesel can be fine. It's when it's taken into the monoculture, into the giant, so it's a disaster. And that's true of so many things. I can go on forever, so I better stop here. But I very much hope that, as Laura said, that you'll sign up to our alliance, that you'll stay in touch with us, because we do have a lot of contacts, a lot of information, and we're going to be doing more on the web. We're going to be doing more conferences, more webinars. We're also going to be running a course. So sign up also for our email newsletter that comes out regularly. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. So we have a few people with their hands raised, which I'm going to assume is a question. So I'll allow you both to speak. Oh, there's 3 people. So I'll allow all 3 of you to speak. Maria, if you start, and then go from there.
Yes. Hello, this is Maria Ernström Fuentes from Finland. I've been involved in setting up. I'm a researcher, and I'm also active in the local economy. Been involved in setting up a network, the RICO network, which is quite big now in the Nordics, but we set up the first one here in Vasa in Finland some 6 years ago. And I agree with you on the local food issue that it's really important. But I find that struggling with now, trying to step it up and having done some research with the farmers, is how do you reach out to farmers that are, although they are locally producing, they are still very much attached to this global dependency, finances, indebted with the banks and the capital investment they have to do in this monoculture agriculture, means that there's a mindset, but there is also the kind of structural limits to what they can do to localize more. They're not really open for this.
Yeah, well, very good question. And we do have a lot of experience with that, and especially with farmers, you know, telling us and just dismissing what we're saying, because they have not been trained to look at the interface between the economy and farming. And in fact, almost no institutions or organizations have been doing that in the way that we have. So we have a certain expertise, but it's not taken seriously by most farmers, I have to say. And what I've found is that most of these initiatives that are set up are very often a collaboration between some growers, and very often it's more consumer driven. I would say generally in the industrialized world that is particularly women driven. You know, and I'm thinking now even of a farmer's wife in Devon, you know, years ago. Her story was so moving. He was heading towards bankruptcy, he was drinking, he was deeply depressed. But the idea that a farmer's market could work, he just thought was ridiculous. She had heard that we had set up some others in England and had thought that maybe this can save us. You know, she set about, got some other people to work with her, and they worked really hard. You know, it's always, we've found, you know, it is a struggle to convince the farmers themselves to convince the local government, you know, to get the place. And then they finally managed to get a small market in this small town in Devon, and it poured with rain, and they thought, this is it. But actually, even in the pouring rain, it was successful enough that it went on and went from strength to strength. And this has happened, I would say, at least in 80% of the cases we know of, where these initiatives are started. Very often it's women who actually, as I say, take the initiative, and it may be women researchers like you. The best thing, so one of the things that we need to do a better job of, and we're so limited, we're a very small international organization, we've not been focusing on getting bigger. We definitely need to raise more funding, because we'd like to have more researchers. Because one of the things we have got to show is that the systemic path our governments have been pursuing throughout the industrial era with so-called cheap oil and generally cheap energy, it's a lie. It's never been cheap. It's caused wars. It's incredibly expensive. When you look at the entire system from extraction to the use, but it's been made artificially cheap. And in contrast, human labor, human hands, human eyes, human hearts, and care have been made artificially expensive. So this, I know this sounds very big, and again, it's hard for people to imagine how we might change it, but it could actually be changed very quickly through policy change. You know, we need to start looking at how energy intensive the path is. You know, we've got, you know, trains with windows you can't open without electronic use. You can't, I mean, the waste of energy. And now the huge propaganda for 5G, for robots, for drones, you know, robots in agriculture, huge propaganda. We need to be very clear about needing to use technology to suit human beings and to suit the human scale. But it is a big issue. So on the research side, we need to be spelling that out much more clearly. But in the meanwhile, while the farmer, you know, in terms of converting to diversification, it can be very difficult without enough labor, basically, enough livelihoods. What's so delightful is that at a very small scale around the world, even in China, you know, I've seen like the first CSA farmer who started a little donkey farm and has a CSA linked to Beijing. They are creating livelihoods that there is a real thirst for. There is a micro trend of young people actually want to work on the land. And in many cases, they're even willing to do it as woofers, you know, as volunteers and so on. So a lot of this movement is helped by that cheaper labor and by volunteerism. And so in the meanwhile, until we change policy, this is the kind of thing we need to encourage. And for farmers who are reluctant, we need to give them lots of examples of how it's been helpful to other farmers. So we are also trying to collect more of those examples and to present those stories. Ideally, we would be doing also tours where they can visit the farms and they can see how various mechanisms, whether it's farm shops, whether it's through certain types of co-ops, but co-ops, by the way, the co-op of the future is the cooperation between producer and consumer, which is a different structure from what co-ops have been in the past. The scale, well, I better not belabor too much, but I think presenting as many case studies of where it's worked, showing in Finland, I'm afraid that probably even there they'll be impressed to hear how it's being done in America. And in America, there are certain areas where there's even been some policy change at the local and regional level, especially in Canada, actually. So trying, this, by the way, is another reason why the localization movement needs to be global, why we need much more global collaboration, much more exchange of information, even at the grassroots, but also at the local government level and at the international government level. So I hope that helps a bit.
Thank you, Helena. I'm now going to switch over to a question that's in the chat box, and then we can come back to those with their hands up and get those questions answered as well. So Sophie asked, there was a bit of discussion about this in the chat box actually. Sophie said, Helena, can you talk more about the policies that could be promoted at national level? Is there a country where we can see them being implemented? And then someone replied saying Amsterdam is planning to implement a governmental shift towards Kate Raworth's donut economics. And then someone else replied saying, I'm not sure that the donut economics model really understands localization. I hope you will get the chance to ask your question to Helena. So I thought hopefully you could respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I love Kate, I've met her, but I'm afraid I agree that her framing doesn't encourage decentralization or localization. And I think it's probably because she hasn't had ongoing experience in the so-called third world. Most of the people I know who have a very strong clarity about this have been in both the industrialized, urbanized parts of the world and the less industrialized. And so what we find in the less industrialized, so-called poor countries, there's been much more community, intergenerational community, smaller scale, closer to the land. We've actually experienced that there's a great deal of wealth in many of those aspects and in those structures. And without that experience, I think people often, by remaining inside the industrialized system, they don't recognize the fundamental importance of scale. And by the way, a very important economist who did was Schumacher, who wrote a book called Small is Beautiful. And he was a highly respected German originally, but economist in England. And he wrote a book called Small is Beautiful, which I highly recommend. And interestingly enough, he went to Burma in the 50s and there experienced a culture that was completely non-industrialized, still basically animal and hand labor and so on. No real poverty, and among the happiest, healthiest people he'd ever seen. So he had to rethink his basic economic theories and came out emphasizing both the spiritual dimension and scale as fundamental, human scale. So small is beautiful. So the donut economics, is saying very, very importantly that, of course, nature has limits and that we have to find a way of living within those limits. So it's an important message that I think we need to go further than that. We need to understand better the structures that can genuinely help us to come to a deeper connection, to real interdependence with human scale institutions. And I'm not talking about the village scale of the average village now in India. I'm talking about even looking back to even what we had in Sweden when I was growing up. We weren't so dependent on foreign direct investment, on foreign billionaires, on foreign companies. So this is in no way about being against foreigners or being xenophobic. This is about understanding the structures, the scale that we all need to become more intelligent in the sense of being able to see the impact of what we do. Even as consumers in the dominant system, I talk about it as being our arms have grown so long that we can't see what our hands are doing. So, and when that, you scale that up to what's happening at the government level, and you scale it up even to business level, when you are, producing on the other side of the world and then transporting over here and processing, it's virtually impossible to have this sort of accountability and knowledge to be really responsible, to be ethical, to be wise. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Helena. I think Amber, you're talking is permitted and you're unmuted. So if you have a question, feel free to jump in.
Thank you. Hi, Helena. Thank you so much for organising this. I have also read your Local Futures book and have really enjoyed it. I'm currently a postgraduate student and I'm focusing on aspects of the clean development mechanism and carbon offsetting schemes. And I think I'm trying to relate what I'm researching at the moment to aspects of what you're talking about in terms of localization. And I've been reading quite a lot of concepts around degrowth. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to wrap my head around is what are alternatives to renewable energy schemes and to carbon offsetting where we can live within our means and be able to continue to meet sustainability issues in the global south. And I think that I'm finding it really challenging to see what that looks like in practice, and was wondering whether parts of what you're saying links to degrowth on a community citizen-led kind of movement. And if you have any experience with renewable energy or energy solutions that are moving away from market-led operations to something that's more kind of grassroots, I guess. So yeah, I was wondering whether you have experience in that, whether you can touch on any of that. That would be great. Thank you.
I mean, in fact, I do. I have a lot of experience in renewable energy because I don't know if you know, but our work started in Ladakh, which is West Tibet, and there, you know, I came there before it had been developed, before it had been opened up, and then I was a linguist. I came out originally as part of the film team, but I ended up staying because I fell in love with these people, and there was no real poverty. There was just the most amazingly joyous, vibrant people I'd ever met. And I saw that as this area had been opened up to tourism, was being opened up to development. It's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And it was clear that every single thing that was part of this thing called development was based on fossil fuels. And so it meant, you know, building that road, bringing things in from the outside, which literally overnight led to things like literally butter that had been transported for a week, selling for half the price of local butter in the local market, which made me question, you know, how that was possible, and that led to further research to understand and to see that this is going on around the world. Literally, you know, in England, butter from New Zealand, generally much cheaper than local butter. And we've all told efficiencies of scale, and it's not true. It's the inefficiency that's subsidized in global monopolies, basically. So we then, you know, Ladakh or Little Tibet happened to have more than 300 days a year of sunshine, and I was able to start projects, and we ended up developing what actually became one of the biggest appropriate technology projects in the world. We worked in 100 villages, and we demonstrated both passive solar and some photovoltaic, small-scale hydro. And part of all that work put us in touch with the sort of appropriate technology buffs and institutions all around the world at that time. And we saw that, you know, particularly again there, you want to try to encourage diversity, and you want to encourage that we start by sitting down to really study how much energy we really need and how much we would need if it were about people's needs as opposed to corporate profit. We've had our thinking heavily manipulated, and I'm afraid now that so much of the renewable energy investment has been part of trying to keep this very corrupt system going. It's not corrupt individuals because it's legal, but what's happening to the law and to regulations is systemically wrong, you know, fundamentally wrong, and it's fundamentally anti-democratic. So we need to step back, and without blame, there is no one government, there is no one corporation, there is no one individual to blame. That what is absolutely essential is that we're willing to look honestly and then be willing to speak the truth about what's going on and why, and then really look at coming forth with this systemic perspective. So there, yes, we do know grassroots initiatives, and we do know some that have been supported and that have been, I hope it's still true, for instance, that in Hamburg, the whole city was able to get off this dependence on a corporate system and to have control over their energy production. That certainly was one of the bits of good news that you should find it on our Planet Local series. And what we ourselves found with our project was that it would be relatively easy to provide for people's needs with a range of relatively small-scale renewable energy installations, decentralized. Now, particularly in the so-called third world, the decentralized nature of the demographic pattern still is such that small-scale renewables could answer, you know, a lot of needs. But beware, some of the microgrid stuff that's being pushed now, I'm afraid, is so high-tech that it can't easily be managed or manufactured in those third world countries. Our experience is we manufactured our own water turbines. We didn't actually manufacture the voltaics, but there's so much that certainly could be done at the national level, and we need to be looking at at that. We need to be looking at taking, you know, the power, the political power back in order to take the power as energy back. In terms of other projects now, you know, there are quite a lot of community energy projects where people are coming together with local finance as part of the localization movement. Sometimes just putting together, you know, $100 each, sometimes it's $1,000 each, but local, usually community-led initiatives that have shown very exciting potential. But again, remember, we do need policy change too, and it's the combination. Also just want to say another exciting thing that we're seeing is that the policy change is changing from the bottom up. Because, you know, at the level of local government, even local mayors, we work a lot with the mayor of Seoul, for instance, in South Korea, and many mayors in Tokyo. And the mayors are forced to see more of the social and environmental realities. So they're more in touch, and they're gradually, we see local policy changes coming in, and we work with, you know, a number of mayors. The mayor of Bristol previously, George Ferguson in England, was he's part of our network also, and has really been a great localist. So there's a lot happening, but still I can't give you examples. The previous question was also about policy changes and what we've seen. I can't point to any at the national government level yet that are really meaningful. There was beginnings of something maybe happening with the female prime ministers of New Zealand, was it Finland and Iceland and Scotland, coming together to embrace well-being. But please help us insist on a holistic approach. And so human well-being is not enough. Climate is not enough. We've got to bring together the social and ecological well-being into one framing. The way that we are being blinded and the way the system is winning is by us keeping a narrow focus. So the big picture needs to be the foundation.
Thank you, Helena. There's one other that's had their hand raised since the beginning, that if you have a question, you should be able to talk now because you're unmuted. If not, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, I'll jump back to the chat box. So Miguel asked, he said, "Dear Helena, many people, especially activists, say and believe that capitalism is the reason why our climate is bad. Some of these activists are my friends. How do you think I should justify this or explain it to them?"
Can I say it again? Tell me again. You say the friends are saying that capitalism is the problem.
Capitalism is the reason why our climate is bad.
Yeah, okay. Capitalism is the reason. To some extent, that's true. You know, it's the problem is that usually people who say capitalism is the problem are not aware of the need for more human scale, for decentralization, for localization. And so this means that very often those who critique capitalism are embracing a type of top-down socialism. Now, so I like to explain that in Sweden, where I grew up, after the war, when they brought in again all that cheap oil, what it meant was pushing essentially the chemicals that were used for the war, for the bombs, chemicals on the land, toxic chemicals, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, big machinery, pushing people off the land, where? Into cities. Urbanization is a fundamental part of this global industrial economic system. And the critique of capitalism usually does not go broad enough to critique it from that more ecological and human, psychological and spiritual perspective. So when people were herded into cities, and in Scandinavia, you know, very efficiently and quite nicely done, but into high-rise buildings, also using lots of cement, oil, concrete, and already in the mid-70s, half of all the dwellings in Stockholm, one person living alone. So the breakdown of community, the breakdown of connections to more people into a tiny nuclear family, which is so intense that it often leads to people living completely alone. Now, that brought with it epidemics of depression, even suicide. So that picture is not included in the critique of capitalism. So with that picture, also what we get, having had the experience of more traditional, multi-generational communities, and where people have a deeper knowledge of the plants, the animals, the trees on which they depend, we have seen a way forward that is far easier and far more conducive to happiness and to health. So I hope that you can talk to your friends about, looking at our film, The Economics of Happiness, and perhaps they'll agree that it is a more complete picture that they will find helpful.
Thank you, Helena. Okay, so now we're going to jump back to a live.
That's me. Hello, Helena. It's good to hear your voice. Thank you for echoing all the things I've been saying on my online organic farming courses since the beginning. I met you in Ladakh. I was with you in the Economics of Happiness seminar there. Please, can you speak to price of these chemical foods that we've been weaned on, paying those prices for these last decades? Now, most people, as you know, in several countries, not Ladakh, of course, but they are expecting the lowest price as their sole reason to purchase, and that price could be so much a very big inspiration for people to see that what we're doing here and now, the localization, can really get off to a major start. If you can speak to price, please. Thanks.
Thank you. I think you also wrote a question here about the price. It's very hard to hear you. But I'm very glad you brought up the issue of price, because again, I really hope you will help us to not only say to consumers, you should pay more for your food, but to say, what we're trying to say is, please, if you can, pay a bit more for your food than you would pay in the supermarket. But more importantly, let's get the message out that our taxes are subsidizing toxic production, toxic food, transport, plastic, and the creation of billionaires, trillionaires, while impoverishing and especially, impoverishing and marginalizing farmers. But, we're destroying our health, and we're ending up not just subsidizing old processed food from far away, cheaper than natural local food, but we're subsidizing ill health. And this is good for GDP. If you and I get cancer and we need chemotherapy regularly, that benefits GDP. So this is, again, to come back to Kate Raworth and the donut economics, part of the holistic systemic package has got to expose GDP for what it is. We absolutely must move away from that. But again, I just want to say, for those of you who are interested in policy, it's not just focusing on a different indicator. Again, it's got to be part of that bigger picture. So with the prices, I am absolutely convinced that if we could have access to the media, and we said to people, would you rather your taxes support organic, non-chemical food at a lower price, or food grown with lots of chemicals and coming from far away? Would you rather support the farmers from your region and your country, or support global multinationals to use, slave labor in effect on giant plantations to bring food to you, or support your own farmers? I have no doubt what people would vote for. But again, the problem is that neither left nor right have been discussing these issues clearly. And they really haven't. I don't want to offend my my left-leaning friends, but this is the truth. They have really not done a better job on these issues than the right.
Thank you, Helena. So I'm going to jump back to a question that was asked in the chat. A random one I've just found is from Sarah, who says, agrees about local and systemic. What do you say to multinational online shopping companies, consultancy giants and others who are using their marketing and CSR resources to make promises like we will be a regenerative business by 2030 and are fully committed to ethical value chains? They are increasingly offering to partner with the local and systemic movements you're mentioning.
Yeah, I really think we have to be much more aware and much more critical. Again, realizing that when you're talking about giants, they're not really able to operate in the way that we need to. And this is, I know I'm going to alienate a lot of people because unfortunately the internet in the hands of economic concentration is a very, very dangerous tool. The internet as a tool also with top-down surveillance and control, has been furthering the centralization and the wealth accumulation at the global level. I believe, once we really study this, we would be in favor of using the internet for information exchange, but again, even there, it would have to be much more carefully monitored. And we would need to be using some of these tools, obviously for climate monitoring and all kinds of things, but we would not be making it available for these giant commercial entities. They need to be broken up. They need to be, basically every business needs to belong to a place. In that way, localization is an accurate term, even at the national level. Right now, to the extent that we can gain back genuine democracy at the nation state level, then we can have businesses that are registered in a country, in Australia, in Sweden, or whatever, but they are registered there and they adhere to the rules set by democratic process. So it's completely reversing the situation that's happening now. And that means that to the extent that we need global trade or even global collaboration, there can be collaboration even between businesses, but we do not need a multinational structure where an entity, and it's not just an entity, it's a group of entities working with deregulated finance, make-believe money, fueling this trade in currencies, but also fueling the power and wealth accumulation of the global operators, the Adani miners and the et cetera, et cetera. So we absolutely need to be looking at breaking up that scale, and that includes all the online companies. People are using online now to create local food schemes. In many cases, once we start really getting localization as part of policy change and more people behind it, you wouldn't even need the online if you're actually doing local food scheme. But right now, it can be a good intermediary step. But let's really start looking at the need for this and be very wary of the type of greenwashing and social washing that is going on at every level. HSBC, it advertises itself as the world's local bank because it's everywhere locally. There's a lot to think about there in terms of the basic principle that democratic process determines business, the shape of business, doesn't run business. You don't want government-run business because generally government can get very clunky and bureaucratic, and it's understandable why many people are very wary of regulations, and therefore they're all in favor of deregulation. But they're not looking at the fact that many businesses of a really healthy scale, it might be a chain even of say, 3 restaurants or something, doing an excellent job, responsive to the farmers, responsive to the consumer, genuinely creative, genuinely entrepreneurial. And they are so heavily regulated and so heavily taxed. And in the meanwhile, the McDonald's chain or the KFC or whatever, none of that, and can come in and, destroy their business with these artificially low prices. So, yeah, there's a lot to think about what scale, how important scale is.
Thank you, Helena. We've only got a few minutes left. So I don't know if you want one more question or if you'd like to finish off with something. It's up to you.
Well, are there anyone who's really keen to ask? Is that Mahi Paquet? Is that someone who's got
Yes, please.
Hello.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm
Sorry, I
Jaya.
think it's two people unmuted. I'm Mahi. There's Jaya.
Okay, we'll try. Mahi, if you start, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to also include Jaya too.
Okay. Hi, thank you, Helena. I'm a Canadian in Australia doing a PhD on planetary ethics and decision-making in small and medium businesses. It's a PhD in education, and I'm touching on a few topics like localization and other ones like the donut economics and circular economy. And in my semi-structured interviews with participants, I'm asking questions about ethical perspectives. And just so far with the short amount of interviews I've done, I can notice that some participants, well, most of them feel really disempowered in the face of the sort of systemic corruption and decision-making that's happening above them. And I do see that they have a lot of power as a small and medium business group because it represents a huge part of the population that have power to influence things. But I would like to know if you would have an idea of a question that could spark this sort of understanding, or if you have something to say regarding this disempowerment.
Well, I mean, I certainly do. I have something to say about the disempowerment. It's just, I believe again that it's so much to do with a lack of awareness of what's actually been going on, and how there's been this very clear path whereby the giant multinationals have, gained more and more power, not just over our governments, but intellectually over us. And part of it has been, this idea that human beings don't want to change and we're to blame for the environmental crisis, and that, the young people pushed so hard at school and university and, pushed to either go into the big city and have some really demanding job, and the house prices are too high, and when they get depressed or anxious or addicted, all this self-blame. So I just believe that the bigger picture could be so liberating, so empowering for people if they could see how we all have a joint, we would have such a joint benefit by together articulating that bigger picture and seeing, yeah, this is the reason why, your small business or, what you're doing is a bloody struggle and why you may not be doing so well. But look at this. And again, I know that people also get very disempowered by, so I believe that one of the reasons for the disempowerment, as I say, is a lack of awareness of this clear trajectory of the deregulation and no taxes globally. No taxes globally, a lot of people know about, but they don't talk about the deregulation because that's been absolutely sort of taboo and silenced in weird ways. But I think knowing how it's been made so much worse helps us to understand how we can make it better. Also, I think we just rejoice and are amazed at how much has been accomplished at the local level. Small and unimportant, people doing amazing things when they come together. So again, if you could do as much as possible in your research to make visible the business alliances, and it's it's not huge, but it's very widespread. And so in a sense, in terms of the numbers, it's remarkable how much has happened with no help from government, no help from mainstream, no help from mainstream academia or any of, the money. It's been sort of the smell of an oily rag or whatever you say, that people have managed to create alternatives that demonstrate the benefits. So for instance, small business alliances linked with consumers that can help. So they're helping each other, the consumers are helping them, you create a loyalty card, and as I said, also local financing to keep these things going. There are models, there are examples that hopefully, if you make them more visible, can show the power that is possible. But also, we have to keep explaining that if we change policy even just a little bit, it could just make an amazing difference.
Thank you, Helena. Jaya, I know you wanted to ask a question as well, if you're still there.
Yes, thank you. I've got a question about financially investing in food security. I'm not confident with the current global economic situation, especially seeing all this virus stuff going on. I live in a rich country. I live in Australia, where the real estate market has been overinflated for a very long time. And to put it simply, I've got some money that I would like to invest, and I don't want to invest in the share market. I don't want to invest in real estate. And how could I invest in local food security?
Well, I think that sounds great. And there are people, where are you?
I'm on the Sunshine Coast, which is just north of Brisbane. Yeah. About 3 hours from about 3 hours from Byron Bay.
Yeah, because here in Byron recently, there's a group of investors who have put money in together to create a sort of alternative bank. And I think ideally, again, you would see if there are other people you can link up with to do this jointly. And there are ways in which you can. There's a nice example of something called slow money in America as well. And you can actually, as you say, you're very wise to try to think of putting at least some of your money in that. You can really be investing in something that is really healthy and positive, and it's real. So ultimately, community, land, food is going to be the real wealth. And I have not, my husband and I still have some money in banks and so on, but we've just basically lived very simply, and certainly, taking it out of the mainstream markets makes a lot of sense. I don't dare to, take responsibility to say, do exactly this, in case somehow it didn't work out. But please investigate. There are lots of examples, and slow money is one. In the Byron area, people are starting something they're calling a village well, which is local investors putting money together to support local businesses. But I'm really glad that you're talking about local food, because they are not. I'm trying to really influence them to focus more on local food. And I think that's where the real need is, and that's also where the real security actually is. So if you can, perhaps link up with a few others, and because it depends, I don't know how much money you have, but one of the things that you would probably need to do is to fund someone to do research for you to see what the possibilities might be in your region. And then you might decide not to invest it right in your very neighborhood, but you could possibly come to this area, but it will take some time and some research to find the right match. So we better end for there, because I have another thing tonight. So
thank you.
On the web a lot. But thank you everybody for coming, and hope we'll hear from you. Hope you stay in touch. And thank you, Laura. Thank you, Henry, who I know you were on there too. Shall we see Henry? Can we say hello to Henry?
Is he still there?
Are you still there, Henry? No? Anyway, Henry works with us. Oh, there you are. Can we see you?
I don't think you can see me. You can just hear me.
Oh, okay. Hello, Henry. Thank you for putting in some of those answers.
Oh.
All right. We better go. Yeah, Henry, thank you. Thanks to everybody. Bye.
Great to meet you all. Bye.
Bye.